Beneath the shimmering chandeliers of an opulent restaurant, a frail elderly woman stepped inside. Her presence was unassuming, her footsteps light against the marble floor. No one paid her any mind, just another patron, another quiet guest. But what they didn't know was that this woman carried with her a truth so shocking, so earth-shattering, that in mere moments, the entire room would be frozen in disbelief. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over Beaumont's, its rays streaming through the towering windows of Portland's most prestigious fine dining restaurant. Inside, the soft murmur of hushed conversations blended with the crisp chime of crystal glasses and the soothing melody of a pianist tucked away in the corner. This was the kind of place where power brokers closed multi-million-dollar deals over dry-aged steaks and vintage Cabernet, where the city's elite gathered to toast milestones beneath the flickering glow of candlelight. Amid the perfectly pressed suits and glistening silverware, the restaurant's grand doors eased open. A dignified elderly black woman stepped inside. Her movements were deliberate, each step steady and purposeful, despite the years etched into her frame. She wore a navy blue coat, its cuffs adorned with intricate embroidery, and clutched a small black handbag close to her side. Though her expression remained composed, there was an unmistakable air of quiet authority about her, something that caused a few curious diners to glance in her direction. At the hostess stand, a young woman greeted her with a polished smile pleasant enough, yet carrying the faintest edge of hesitation, the kind of subtle restraint that didn't go unnoticed. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, her tone polite but brisk, eyes flicking toward the entrance as if mindful of the next guest in line. "Yes," the woman replied evenly. "Under the name Mrs. Holloway." The hostess scanned her list, gave a brief nod, then gestured for Mrs. Holloway to follow. But instead of leading her to one of the prime tables by the window, where golden sunlight danced off wine glasses and the city skyline stretched in the distance, she guided her toward a cramped corner near the kitchen. It was a seat of inconvenience, where the warmth of the dining room faded into the chill of passing servers, where the clatter of plates and the sharp hiss of steam from the kitchen bled into the air. Yet Mrs. Holloway said nothing. She moved with quiet dignity, settling into her seat, folding her hands gently atop the polished table. Her eyes skimmed the menu, though she already knew the choices by heart. Minutes passed, then several more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Todd, floated past her table again and again, his gaze skimming over her as if she were invisible. He paused at nearby tables, laughing softly with guests, pouring wine with effortless charm, anticipating needs before they were even voiced. But Mrs. Holloway remained untouched by his attention, an afterthought in a room brimming with warmth and hospitality, just not for her. Finally, after what felt like an unspoken test of patience, Todd stopped at her table. His smile was tight, his words brisk. "Sorry for the wait," he said, barely sparing her a glance. "We're really busy right now." Then, without waiting for a response, he added, "I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Holloway nodded gracefully, offering a quiet "thank you." But as she sat there, she couldn't help but take in the contrast. Just a few feet away, younger, casually dressed diners were met with immediate and effortless service. Their menus were handed over with easy smiles, drinks refilled before the ice had a chance to melt. Conversations flowed, unhurried and uninterrupted, untouched by wait times or second glances. Yet, amid the clinking glasses and murmured exchanges, she noticed the looks, the lingering stares, the whispered words passed between tables just out of earshot. She noticed everything. A woman seated 2 tables away leaned in closer to her partner, murmuring something under her breath while stealing quick glances in Mrs. Holloway's direction. Across the room, another diner furrowed their brow, their gaze flicking back and forth as if trying to place why exactly she seemed out of step with the setting. The minutes dragged, stretching longer than they should have. When Todd finally returned, There was no shift in his demeanor, no warmth, no effort to mask his indifference. "Sorry," he said flatly, still refusing to meet her eyes. "We're a little understaffed today. Might be a while before I can get to you." A faint smile touched Mrs. Holloway's lips. "Take your time," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the frustration she might have felt. She wasn't here to make a scene. She never was. But the weight of the room pressed around her, thick with tension, seeping into hushed conversations and sidelong glances that never quite lingered long enough to be called stares. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture effortlessly composed, fingers resting lightly against the table as if she were simply passing the time. This wasn't new. She had seen it before, felt it in spaces just like this exclusion that never spoke its name aloud. It didn't arrive in sharp words or outright refusals. It came in the pauses, the delays, the service that never quite reached her table. But Mrs. Holloway had long since learned that silence could be just as powerful as words, and so she waited. She always did. Across the room, someone took notice. Their expression darkened, the shift subtle but undeniable. From her quiet corner, Mrs. Holloway surveyed the restaurant with composed stillness. She watched as Todd moved effortlessly between tables, his demeanor light and engaging. With one guest, he shared a casual laugh. With another, he leaned in slightly, his voice warm and familiar. Every interaction was polished, easy crafted for comfort. But each time he passed her table, he never once looked her way. The weight of it settled over the room. A young couple near the center exchanged uneasy glances. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" The woman's voice barely rose above the soft hum of the ambient music, yet there was an edge to it. Her partner glanced at Todd, watching him move past Mrs. Holloway with practiced indifference. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Still, Mrs. Holloway remained poised. She had long mastered the art of patience, of restraint. But a quiet question lingered beneath the surface. How far would this go? She reached for her water glass. Empty. A few tables away, a waiter poured a fresh glass of wine for a guest who had arrived well after she had. The contrast was glaring, unmistakable. Then, finally, Todd reappeared. A tray balanced effortlessly in his hands, plates steaming with meals meant for another table. But as he passed her, he paused just for a moment. His expression unreadable, his tone laced with impatience. "Still haven't decided?" As if the delay had been hers all along. Mrs. Holloway looked up, her gaze steady, calm, yet unwavering. There was kindness in her eyes, but beneath it, a quiet intensity that made Todd falter, just for a fraction of a second. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her voice measured, polite. Todd gave a quick nod, muttering something under his breath as he turned away, eager to move on. But he wasn't the only one watching. Near the bar, a man in his late 30s sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer, his posture was easy, almost relaxed, but his eyes told a different story, sharp, calculated, watching. He had seen it all, every subtle slight, every dismissive glance, every unspoken message woven into delays and indifference. His fingers tapped against the polished table, the rhythm slow, controlled. But with each passing second, his expression darkened, his jaw tightening. Because he wasn't just another diner. He was the restaurant's owner, and Mrs. Holloway wasn't just another patron. She was his mother, but Elijah Holloway wasn't ready to intervene, not yet. He wanted to see exactly how far this would go. How Todd would treat someone he assumed held no power. Across the room, Todd laughed at another table, effortlessly charming, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. The air grew thick, heavy with something unspoken. The clinking of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, everything seemed to slow, as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break, and it was only a matter of time. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table in that same measured rhythm. He wasn't the type to lose his temper, not easily. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him that patience was often the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. But this was different. Watching his mother endure this kind of quiet, calculated mistreatment sent a slow, simmering rage coursing through him. Beaumont's wasn't just a business. It was a testament to everything his mother had taught him: respect, integrity, fairness. And tonight he would make sure those values were remembered. She had been his anchor through every storm, the voice that urged him forward when the odds were stacked against him. Through sleepless nights and uncertain mornings, she had been the unwavering presence that kept him steady. And now, watching her be treated like she didn't belong in a space he had built, it felt personal. His eyes followed Todd, studying his every move. The way he deliberately avoided table 12, the way his charm melted effortlessly into laughter at other tables, only to harden the second he glanced in her direction. And then, the final insult a fleeting smirk exchanged with another server. Like it was a joke, Elijah's grip tightened around his glass. This restaurant was his domain, his pride. Every detail, the carefully curated menu, the warm, welcoming ambience, bore his mark. He had poured everything into this place, crafting it with the very values his mother had instilled in him. And yet, in this moment, he felt powerless. The one person in the world he would never allow to be disrespected was enduring it all with grace. He wasn't sure he could do the same. His mind raced. Should he call Todd out now in front of everyone? Expose him, make an example of him? Or should he wait, let this play out just a little longer, to ensure there was no room for excuses? Either way, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Patience won. For now. Elijah lifted a hand, a subtle yet unmistakable signal. Across the room, Donna, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman who had worked alongside him long enough to sense when something was off, approached his table with measured steps. "Keep an eye on table 12, Elijah murmured, his voice low, controlled. His gaze never wavered from Todd. "I want to see how he handles this. Don't intervene, not yet." Dana hesitated, just for a second. Then she gave a small nod. She knew better than to question Elijah when his tone carried that edge. His attention shifted back to his mother. She glanced at her watch, her movements unhurried, composed, no sign of impatience. No flicker of frustration. She wasn't going to complain. She never did, but that didn't mean Elijah would let this go. He knew his mother well enough to understand. She didn't believe in making a scene. She believed in letting actions speak louder than words. And Elijah believed in actions too. Soon, Todd would understand that firsthand. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Conversations dulled to hushed murmurs. More and more patrons stole subtle glances toward table 12, sensing something was brewing beneath the surface. And yet, Todd, whether oblivious or emboldened, remained unchanged. He passed by her table once more. This time, Mrs. Holloway raised a hand, polite, measured. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice cutting clean through the low hum of the room. For the first time, Todd hesitated. His jaw tightened. "Yes?" He replied curtly, his tone laced with barely masked irritation. Mrs. Holloway met his gaze, steady and poised. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy." The words were gentle, but their meaning was unmistakable. Todd exhaled audibly, shifting his weight, casting a glance around as if searching for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, already turning away before she could respond. And that was when Elijah stood. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. The air in the restaurant changed. Without a word, he crossed the room, the sheer weight of his presence demanding attention. At another table, Todd was mid-conversation, laughing lightly. When he felt it, that invisible force of someone standing behind him, he turned, and just like that, his expression shifted. The casual arrogance drained away, replaced by something else. A sudden creeping uncertainty. "Elijah," Todd stammered, his voice hitching as he forced an uneasy smile. I didn't know you were here." Elijah held his gaze, his expression unreadable, his voice calm too calm. But beneath that calm was an edge, sharp and unmistakable. "I've been here." Todd's smile wavered. Elijah's eyes flicked toward table 12, then back to Todd. "And I've been watching." A thin line of tension stretched across Todd's face. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Watching what?" he asked, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Elijah didn't blink. "Watching you ignore my mother," he said evenly. "Who's been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water?" The color drained from Todd's face. The room had gone silent, and Elijah wasn't done. Todd's eyes darted toward Mrs. Holloway, his stance shifting, his breath shallow. She sat upright now, her calm, unwavering gaze locked onto the scene unfolding before her. Your mother?" Todd stammered, his voice cracking. Elijah didn't blink. "Yes, my mother," he said, his tone like cut stone, each word deliberate. "The woman you treated like an inconvenience. The woman you decided didn't deserve the same respect you've been handing out to every other table in this room." Not a whisper, not a murmur, just silence. Even the pianist had stopped mid-note, his fingers frozen above the keys. Todd's mouth opened, scrambling for an explanation, an excuse anything. But Elijah didn't give him the chance. "Save it," he said, his voice cold, absolute. "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." He let the words settle, let them hang in the air like a verdict already cast. Then, with the same measured control, Elijah turned his attention shifting toward Dana, who had been hovering near the bar, torn between stepping in and staying back. She didn't need to step in now. This was already in motion. And Todd knew it. Dana. Elijah's voice was steady, not raised, not rushed, but firm, a tone that left no room for hesitation. "Take over table 12. Make sure my mother has everything she needs immediately." Dana nodded swiftly, snapping into action. She moved with purpose, her face clouded with quiet remorse as she reached Mrs. Holloway's table. With careful precision, she poured a fresh glass of water, handed over a menu, and whispered a flurry of apologies that, perhaps, weren't even hers to give. Elijah turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said flatly. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Todd didn't move at first. Frozen in place, his face flickered with humiliation, with regret, too little, too late. Then, without another word, he reached behind him, untied his apron, set it down, and walked toward the exit. The heavy restaurant door swung shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the space. The silence stretched for a moment longer, thick with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Then Elijah turned, his focus shifting back to his mother. He crossed the room, lowering himself slightly beside her chair, his strong presence softening for the first time that evening. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Mrs. Holloway smiled, the warmth in her expression unwavering as she reached out, patting his hand with gentle reassurance. "I'm fine, son. You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the tightness in his shoulders easing, but not completely. "I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head, her voice steady, knowing, no, you let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away. The words settled deep. The restaurant gradually stirred back to life, conversations rising once more, silverware clinking softly against fine china, yet something had shifted. The air carried a different energy, more subdued, more thoughtful. People had seen, and they wouldn't forget. The patrons who had witnessed the scene now looked at Mrs. Holloway differently, with something deeper in their expressions, respect, admiration. Elijah returned to his table, his face composed, though the embers of anger still flickered in his eyes. Across the room, Dana ensured that Mrs. Holloway's meal was served promptly, her actions carrying an unspoken promise things would be different from now on. And no one in Beaumont's would forget the lesson they had just witnessed. Dana personally delivered each dish, her apology threaded into every careful gesture, as if she were trying to undo the weight of the entire evening. Mrs. Holloway accepted it, as she always did, with quiet grace, a small nod, a gentle acknowledgement. Then, without a word, she turned her attention to her meal. She didn't need grand gestures, she never had. Her dignity had already spoken volumes. Across the room, a young couple who had been watching the entire scene leaned in toward each other. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman whispered, shaking her head. "It really makes you think, how often does this happen, and no one says anything?" Her partner exhaled, nodding, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about what you see," he murmured. "It's about what you're willing to stand up against when it happens." Elijah caught their words as he passed by on his way back to his mother, and they settled in his mind, heavy with truth. How many times had people like Todd gotten away with this? Because no one was watching? Or worse, because no one cared enough to step in? When Elijah sat down beside his mother, she reached across the table, her fingers wrapping gently around his hand. "You've built something beautiful here, Elijah," she said softly. "But remember places like this? They're not just about food or ambience. They're about how people feel when they walk through those doors." Elijah let out a slow breath. "I know, Mom." His voice carried something between regret and resolve. "I let you down tonight." She shook her head. "No, you didn't." Her words were steady, certain. "You gave everyone here a chance to see the truth. And you handled it with integrity. That's what matters." Around them, the atmosphere in Beaumont's had shifted. The staff moved with more attentiveness, their service more deliberate, not just out of obligation, not just to avoid another incident, but because of something unspoken, something understood, an unspoken lesson, one that would linger long after the night had ended. Elijah's actions had left an undeniable truth in their wake. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Holloway finished her meal, she took a quiet glance around the room. Her eyes briefly met Donna's, who offered a small, apologetic smile. There was no bitterness in Mrs. Holloway's expression, only a quiet satisfaction. The moment had left its mark. But for Elijah, this lesson wasn't just for Todd. It wasn't just for the staff. It was for himself, too. Leadership wasn't just about managing operations. It wasn't about numbers, logistics, or the menu. It was about upholding the values that made his restaurant more than just a place to eat. It had to be a place worth remembering. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Holloway gathered her things, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped into the cool night air. For a moment, they stood together, bathed in the golden glow spilling from the restaurant windows, their reflections shimmering in the glass. "You did good, son," she said, her voice warm, steady, softening the edges of the day. Elijah managed a faint smile. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her grip firm, reassuring. "What matters is how you responded," she told him. "You gave everyone in there something to think about. Something they'll carry with them. That's the real change." He nodded, watching as she made her way toward the car waiting at the curb. Just before stepping in, she turned back, offering him one last knowing smile. Inside, the restaurant had settled into its late-night rhythm. The clinking of dishes, the quiet conversations. But something had changed. Dana gathered the staff near the bar, her expression serious but steady. "What happened tonight is a wake-up call," she began. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the culture we create here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, no exceptions." A quiet ripple of nods spread through the group. Their faces were solemn, thoughtful. Todd's absence was palpable. A stark reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professionalism. and no one would forget it. Elijah stepped back inside, his gaze sweeping over the emptying dining room. The weight of the evening still lingered in the air, but so did something else. A renewed commitment. Beaumont's couldn't just be a restaurant. It had to be more. A place where dignity and kindness were served alongside the finest meals. For the guests who had witnessed it all, tonight would linger in their minds. They had come for fine dining, but they left with a story. A story that reminded them of the power of respect, the importance of standing up, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to let injustice define them. And now to you, the one watching this unfold, take a moment. Ask yourself, if you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent, letting it pass unnoticed? These moments don't always announce themselves. They don't come with warning signs, but they're everywhere. Let this story serve as a reminder. Stand for dignity. Lead with empathy every time. And if this story resonated with you, don't just walk away. Subscribe, share. Because conversations like this, they're how we change, together.